As June said, I'm Brian Probalski, Vice President of the Molten-Niguel Water District. And today I have the honor of introducing our esteemed keynote speaker, Lauren Woodman, who is the Chief Executive Officer of DataKind. And I have to say that as I was collaborating with the AI to prepare my notes here, I thought this can't be right. This has to be a hallucination. One person can't have this resume. It must be combining people, but it's true. It's true. Lauren has a remarkable career spanning 25 years and has emerged as a visionary leader at the intersection of technology, development, and policy, making her the perfect person to address the multifaceted challenges and opportunities presented by our summit's theme, Intelligent Questioning, Sharing Water Wisdom. In our pursuit of understanding how data can revolutionize water management, Lauren's journey is the trifecta of having navigated pivotal roles in the private sector, government, and nonprofits, including working for the United Nations as a congressional liaison, being the CEO of NetHope, where she united some of the world's largest nonprofits and tech giants, and a decade-long tenure at Microsoft, where she played a pivotal role. She's also currently serving as an executive of the Software Industry Association? No, that was in the past. So today, Lauren's role is as CEO of DataKind and a member of the World Economic Forum Board of Stewards for Digital Economy and Trustworthy Data Collaboration, and that cements her clearly as a thought leader at the forefront of our discussions. As we dive into the emerging technologies of water policy challenges, global perspectives, and the data revolution, Lauren's insights can help us illuminate possibilities and innovations. Her expertise can help us view how we discuss these topics. We're honored to have her lend her expertise to the California Data Collaborative's Water Summit to gain insights into why data and collaborative efforts are paramount for effective water planning and rapidly changing environment. Her journey of wisdom and commitment to a more sustainable future embody the immense power of intelligent questioning, the theme of our event, and our collaborative exploration to the knowledge and the exchange that encapsulates everything we're talking about here. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a warm and wholehearted welcome to our esteemed keynote speaker, Lauren Woodman. Thank you, Lauren.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to ask Brian if he could record that so I can take it home to my teenage daughters. And maybe play that at a choice moment or two. There are some choice moments in my house with a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, but be that as it may. They're lovely children, fantastic children. All right, let me make sure I can know what I'm doing here. Okay, thank you for having me join today. And I had a blast yesterday, frankly, listening to all the conversations and learning about water and water technologies and how folks are using data, things that I just didn't know. And my husband was laughing last night because I was talking about all the cool tech and how we can do these things with LiDAR and we can figure out groundwater. And he said, "You're really geeking out on this." And I said, "Yeah, because it's really fascinating." And it's really encouraging to see that we are thinking about data and AI and all of these types of tools and how we solve what are very difficult and intractable problems. As Brian said, I've been working in tech and tech for impact for longer than I probably should. Back when I first started my career a very long time ago, the definition of tech policy was how much money are we going to give NASA and the National Institutes of Health. I mean, that was the extent of tech policy, really. And then this thing called the internet came along, and all of a sudden the world changed. And I think we're at one of those watershed moments now where the world is changing in terms of what we can do and unlocking insights and knowledge from data that we have been collecting for a very long time. And will continue to collect and increasingly can collect in interesting and fascinating ways, as I was telling my husband last night. And sort of figuring out how we navigate that is really critically important. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes with some ideas. You can think they're great ideas, you can think they're terrible ideas. Technology is one of those things that is constantly evolving, and so sort of diving into it, and as we talked about yesterday on a panel, sometimes you just kind of have to get started and get into it to sort of see where it's going to take you. So let's see where this takes us. A little bit about DataKind. DataKind is a nonprofit, and our whole focus is on tackling hard problems with data and AI. But we started 10 years ago as a way to say, look, data science is this emerging field. Our founder was a Stanford PhD in statistics, and he was like, I have two choices in my life. I can go write recommendation engines for e-commerce sites, or I can figure out how to use this stuff in ways that have a real impact on the world. And what he found with a lot of his colleagues and classmates was there's a real interest in having an impact on the world, and so he put a blog post up. I was living in New York at the time, put a blog post up, and 140 data scientists showed up and said, and a bunch of nonprofits showed up, and they spent the entire weekend eating pizza, as one does in the tech sector when you're young and trying to figure these things out, saying, what can we unlock? And thus the organization was born. And so over the past 10 years, that's all we've done, is we work alongside social impact organizations to sort of figure out, what the impact can be. It's a large organization at this point in time. We work on almost every continent, and there's about 25,000 volunteers that we sort of pull together to sort of figure out some of these problems. And one of our more interesting projects that we've done over the years was actually with Moulton Nagel, as Jonathan was talking about yesterday, and trying to help them determine whether or not a certain investment was necessary or if there were other ways to go about doing that. And I say that because one of the things that all of these people in this broad community believe is that data allows us to work with greater certainty, efficacy, and impact. And that's kind of the thing that drives us forward. I mean, data is interesting. Ones and zeros are interesting within and of themselves, and we can ask lots of good questions about them. But we do that with the purpose of trying to figure out, what does the world around us look like? What are we doing? What should we be doing about it? And what do we think will happen if we take these actions? And did that thing happen? That's all we're really trying to figure out with data. And one of the things that was interesting to me yesterday, as I was listening to various panelists throughout the day, was it struck me that in a world where we are trying to figure out water, which is so critically important for health and economic development and agriculture and, swimming and floating and all of these types of things. The historical data that we have, given climate change and the impact of those changes, that's a level of uncertainty that we're not really comfortable with. And so how do we actually use data, and what data do we use to get to a greater level of certainty that will allow us to act in ways that we think are important for the communities that we serve? Now, there's a lot of data. So we create roughly 330 terabytes of data every day. This was so much fun to work out. If you watch Netflix in HD, so not like Netflix on your phone, but like HD Netflix, you would have to watch Netflix for 12.5 million years, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, in order to generate that much data, to use that much data. But we do that every single solitary day. And what's more interesting is 90% of that has happened in the last 2 years. And just think about, that is an enormous amount of data. And you can say, okay, well, why are we creating that much data? But everything creates data. Absolutely everything creates data. And the insights that you get, from looking at data and trying to figure out, yesterday I was listening to someone talk about, just all sorts of words I didn't know, continuous use, that was fascinating, in terms of how you monitor water. But, looking at why were certain residential households seeing a spike in water usage late at night. Well, it's because their teenage kids were coming home and they were taking showers after their football games or whatever the case may be. And I was like, that's fascinating. I mean, the data within and of itself, okay, so there was water, then it went up, okay. But what's really fascinating is what the actions were behind that. And so all of the things that we do all day long, every time we, pick up your phone, that's a piece of data. And so there's this enormous amount of data that we can tap into that tells us what's happening in the world around us, and that allows us to get insights around what we should be doing. The problem is data isn't information. Data's just not useful. I mean, I could tell you the numbers, 9, 8, 1, 0, and 3. That's all data. Doesn't tell you, no context for what that means. My zip code, by the way. And with between my zip code and my last name, you could figure out where I live. All of a sudden, all of this information is available. Maybe I shouldn't be putting out my zip code out there, but it's a big city. But it's one of those things where the numbers themselves are not interesting. The numbers themselves, the actual data points, while they're fascinating to see numbers on a page, and there's all sorts of things about human cognition that are fascinating behind that, but within and of themselves, they're not that important. It's the process of how we get from data to information that is actionable that is really critical for all of us that work in the data space. It is that transition that makes data useful and allows us to get to that point of greater certainty. And we do that by asking questions and trying to figure out what that data is telling us. So how do we do this? Like, what can data do for us? Well, first thing is, data can tell us what's actually happening in the world around us. And there are really interesting questions around being able to identify sources of data, who can access that data, and do we trust that data? And that within and of itself sets a context for all of us in making decisions and figuring out what the world around us is telling us. It's interesting sometimes to talk with folks about being data-driven, because a lot of us trust our gut more than we trust what the data is telling us. And that's really hard organizationally for folks to start looking at data if that data doesn't feel like what you thought was happening. And so data gives us a baseline around saying, what is actually happening in the world around us? Is it that we've used data to fix the large leaks in residential facilities, but now we can go see, the smaller leaks that are happening maybe under the ground or whatnot, or slow leaks and these types of things. If we think that our water system is working great, then it's hard to see that data and believe that that's actually what's happening. But data allows us to get a real sense as to what the current state is and where we are today. The other thing that data allows us to do is to understand what is happening and what could happen in a way that is intelligible and accessible for a broad audience, right? And so we can model what will happen if X. If X, then what? If X, then, do we have the impact that we wanted to have? And so understanding and getting that comprehension of what's happening is critically important. What that requires is the contextualization of the data itself. 98103 isn't interesting. If I tell you it's a zip code, it's interesting. If I say, oh, that's about an address, that, all of a sudden those numbers make more sense. And so understanding what's actually happening is the second thing that we think data can do very well. And then the third thing is, how do we respond? How might we act? What are the options that are available to us? Knowing what's happening, knowing what could happen, then what choices do we make? And that's the continuum that we're all on to get from data to information and trying to figure out how these things are useful. So I want to give you a couple of examples of projects that we have done that are not related to water, but I think just in listening yesterday and thinking about this are some examples of how data gets utilized in interesting ways. The first is something we did over the last 18 months or so that we did in partnership with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Black Wealth Data Center, which pulls together all the way down to the census tract level, all sorts of information that is racially disaggregated around economic opportunity, education, home ownership, entrepreneurship, access to services, all sorts of things. And you can go and compare and dig into this data. It's fascinating data. And what's interesting about this is when policymakers are having conversations about equity at a community level, part of the challenge is a lot of times they don't know. They sense that there are challenges. They sense that there are disequities and inequities that are happening in their community, but they can't really parse them apart, right? They don't really have a good sense. And so if you can surface data and make data publicly available, and this is all based on publicly available data from multiple different sources, there's probably 30 or 40 different data sources behind this, then all of a sudden you can actually understand what's happening and then figure out what action should we take. And one of the things I was thinking about as we were, as I was thinking about this last night and reflecting on the conversations yesterday, Gina made a good point yesterday in the panel that I shared with her around how do you know if the stuff you're doing is actually working? And how do you figure out how you change behavior, right? And part of changing behavior is telling people what's actually happening. When I was at Microsoft, we did a project. This is maybe not for great public consumption, but we were trying to do water conservation, and we were trying to get people to use less water. And so in the bathrooms of schools in Singapore, we put these little monitors, and when you waved your hand underneath the water, this little digital plant came up. And then the longer you washed your hands, the more the plant died. But what was fascinating about that is we had told kids don't stand there and let the water run, but kids are kids, and you're like, okay, there's no impact of that, and the water's still going to run the next time. But you watch the little plant die, and all of a sudden kids started using less water. We did the same experiment with cars. If we put a monitor in a car and said, look, if you drive at the speed limit and you don't floor it when the light turns green, and you maintain a constant speed, your driving is more gas efficient. We put the same monitor in cars, and what did we see? People changed their behavior. And so making information available to people is the first step in changing behavior. And so this was a huge project that we did because these were questions policymakers were asking. They didn't have the information that they needed. And so we pulled all of this together to help people be able to see what was actually happening in the communities around them. The other one that's interesting is sort of what we did with foreclosure and eviction analysis. And so how do you target programs to communities that need the support? This came out of Central Florida, and we were looking specifically at Orlando and the surrounding counties, of saying there are rent and eviction rent support programs in place. If you're challenged and you can't make your rent this month, it is way better for us to help you make your rent this month than it is to go through the process of eviction and then have people that are then suffering being unhoused, because getting back into housing is much more challenging. And so we started looking at where are evictions happening. And that data is very hard to get in many jurisdictions because it's tied up in housing courts and those types of things. And a lot of what we had to do is to pull data out of not out of structured data, but actually go out and pull it out of PDFs and court filings and websites and all of this kind of stuff. So how do we pull all of that data out and then actually map what's happening? And if we then compared that with the demographics in the region, demographics in each county, one of the things that we found is the reasons for evictions were actually very different from census tract to census tract and county to county. And the thing that was really fascinating was that in Orlando, the delta was about $250. That's what people needed. They needed $250 just to get through this month. Something had happened. The car had broken down. Who knows what. Their paycheck was late. Doesn't matter. It's a lot less expensive to spend $250 to help somebody get through the month than it is to then go deal with having to find someone temporary housing, having to deal with kids that are dropping out of school, the downstream health effects and all of those kinds of things. And so all of a sudden we could figure out, okay, these are places where there is a real need for community services. And we could look at whether or not the policy decisions that had been made were actually having an impact. And so all you data geeks, I put this up there for you. I hope you enjoy this. But the red dotted line actually shows what the one-to-one relationship is between rental assistance and evictions. And so if we were meeting the need, what you would see, the red dotted line is where the need and where those two things match up. The green line is what's actually happening. And so what you see is in many places, the rental assistance program is not meeting the needs of the community, not at all. And so policymakers can say, okay, this tells me what I need to know, we are not meeting the need. One of the challenges is the community didn't know. A lot of community members didn't know that this assistance was available. Someone yesterday was talking about if you have a leak, they have a plumber assistance program, and it can help you get your leak filled. And so, okay, this is a great way to figure out, are we meeting the needs of the community? Are we actually one-on-one in terms of whether or not those resources are available? And so now policymakers in Central Florida and a number of nonprofits and philanthropic organizations are saying, how do we go fill that gap? Right, how do we figure out how we solve that gap? The other thing data can do is make us more efficient, which, anybody working in a nonprofit, in a governmental agency, in a quasi-governmental agency, in a community-focused organization, saving resources is absolutely critical because there's never enough money to do all the things that we need to do. Soil Haiti is a nonprofit that we worked with in Haiti. There's a huge problem in Haiti where people don't have indoor plumbing, and so they use container-based sanitation, and those containers then have to be picked up and sanitized and returned. And it's, if you just look at sort of where the routes were, they were spending an enormous amount of money in figuring out where their routes were. Gas is very expensive in Haiti. There weren't regular pickup times. They didn't know how often containers were getting filled and needed to be removed. And so we went back through and looked at all of the data and then optimized a route for them and a pickup schedule so that people knew that every second Tuesday their container would be picked up and Soil Haiti could optimize their routes. Now you might look at that and say, MapQuest has been doing that for a really long time. And that's true. It absolutely is. It is not always the latest and the greatest that has the most impact. But that capability wasn't available in Haiti. A lot of the roads weren't mapped. And so we had to go pull data from OpenStreetMaps to figure out how we optimized for Soil Haiti. And they had a fairly significant cost savings, and I think we're now implementing this in Rwanda and somewhere else. But Ghana, I think maybe Ghana. Anyway, it's a replicable solution is the point. Okay, this is the one that's maybe most interesting. Or I think is most interesting. One of the things we can use data for is to improve preparation and planning. Pulling together data sources from lots of different places is a challenge that we all have. We're in the process of developing something called the Humanitarian Data Insights Platform. And there's no fancy picture on this one because it's still in development. But the underlying technology is really fascinating. One of the things that often happens when we pull together sites and analyses, and I'm sure you run into this challenge, is what data am I going to use? And so you pull in a bunch of data, and maybe you go through the process of cleaning it, and maybe it's data from disparate parts of the water system. Maybe it's different data that's publicly available. Maybe you're pulling it in from another agency. Whatever the case may be, you're pulling that data in, you're lining it all up, you're making sure that it works so that we can ingest it and use it in that analysis. But it's a point in time, right? It's a point in time, and that data is not, it's not live. It's not evergreen, it's not fresh, it's not going to be pulled in. One of the things that happens in the humanitarian space all the time, humanitarian organizations that I've worked with now for 20 years are always required to share enormous amounts of data with the USAID and DFIDs and FCDO and all of the development agencies are required to share that data. And it's all locked up in PDFs and Excel files, and some of it's labeled and some of it's not labeled, and it's a mess. But we start to pull this stuff in, and you can get enormously good insights about what works, what doesn't work, and how can we replicate solutions elsewhere. The problem is point in time. We're using ChatGPT at this point in time, actually GPT-3 to be more specific, to actually automatically identify, meta tag, and ingest data on a live basis into a humanitarian platform that gives us insight. And what's fascinating about that is there are literally hundreds of thousands of Excel spreadsheets sitting out there on the Humanitarian Data Exchange. Some of them we don't even know what country those things, the data represents and what type of activity. But with GPT-3 and using what we know in the underlying models in GPT-3, we can start to make guesses about where that data comes from. We can automatically meta tag it, test it, and if it passes a validity test, bring it into the platform on a live basis. That's fascinating because no longer is data static. All of a sudden, every time data gets uploaded, we can pull it in. And it's not limited to the HDX platform where all the development data is playing. We can pull data from anywhere. We can pull data from any number of different public sources, and we can pull data from individual organizations. So Save the Children that we're working with can say, here's what we have in terms of our data. We know what our data tells us. How does that change when we start to pull in data from other organizations and from past programs and interventions? And I started thinking about that last night with water, because you've got a ton of climate data that's out there that's publicly available that may be relevant to your particular district, to your particular region. There may be data from housing authorities. Where are they going to build? What is the population growth estimates? What are those being based on? How do we start to pull those things in a way that makes sense? The other thing that I will say is in September, we're doing some work that is somewhat similar in that we're using satellite imagery to go create a census of physical infrastructure for countries around the world. And so can we use satellite imagery to detect and label residential buildings, commercial buildings, roads, bridges, all sorts of different types of infrastructure. And that census is being developed so that national governments can then start to think about what the impact of climate change will be on their physical infrastructure, what it might be on their physical infrastructure, and what structures need to be addressed now, which ones can wait, which ones may need to be moved, and so on and so forth. You start thinking about, some of the questions or some of the conversation yesterday around how do I estimate for a residential building versus a commercial building, and we're not even sure if this is residential or commercial or what type of facility that is. That will be publicly available data when it's completed, and then all of a sudden that can complement all of the work that you yourselves are doing. And if you start to look at this sort of dynamic platform where that data can be brought in and compared with your own, all of a sudden things get to be really interesting. Things get to be really interesting about what we can observe, what we can understand, and then how we respond. Okay, all of that's great. I love talking about the projects, but how do you get from where you are today to where you want to be, right? What does that process look like? And it is different in every organization, but I want to, after, 300 or 400 different data science projects, we've learned a couple of things, and so I offer this as a suggestion, knowing that no roadmap is ever perfect. The first is you got to start with a question, which is one of the reasons that I loved the theme for this gathering. You can data science anything. You should not data science everything. It's fun if you're doing college projects, but really, the thing that is interesting about data science is you're trying to figure something out. So what is it that you're trying to figure out? What are the questions that are plaguing you and keeping you from being able to do and achieve what you want to achieve? And knowing those questions, we spend more time scoping a project than we do actually doing a project. Scoping it and figuring out what it is that we're trying to get to and what data will help us unlock those insights is the most critical point of any project. And so as you're thinking about building your infrastructure and building your processes over time, knowing what the questions are or are likely to be will help make sure that you're moving in the right direction. The second is you got to plan for equity, you got to plan for ethics, and you got to plan for risk. Those are tough questions, and nobody knows the answer to them. If anybody tells you that they know how to address this, they are wrong. They just don't. We don't know what the ethical responsibilities will be as AI comes into the workplace. It is an ongoing conversation. And there's a lot of difference between having an AI framework and knowing, do no harm, whatever you want to say. We will do this, we won't do that. But how you implement that on a day-to-day basis in the context of day-to-day work is really hard. The other question is one of equity. California is a state that recognizes water as a human right. That has to be applied to everyone in the communities that you serve. And then so how do you make sure that you actually have access to data that can give you the insights as to whether or not the programs that you have in place and the support that you have in place is actually being distributed and impacting on an equitable level. That is hard because there's not a lot of that data that includes the right feature set to be able to tell us that. And so all of a sudden we have to start grappling with those questions because then it raises the question of, we don't know the answer, so is it ethical to do it in the first place? But is it also not ethical? Is it ethical to not do it? So those questions are all very much interrelated and really difficult ones for folks to grapple with, but you got to start having those conversations because they're not going away. The other question is dealing with risk. And we say a lot of times that you have to think about risk, not in terms of just if you fail, but what if you succeed, right? And so there are risks on both sides. There are always trade-offs. I was thinking about this, and you guys have had a great year. From a water perspective, congratulations. As someone who lives in Seattle, really not that exciting to us, but it's okay. I understand it was critical down here. But there's what happens if we have a very good water year and we save all of this water? Where do we put it? Right? I mean, that was really fascinating to me yesterday. Yeah, where do you store all of that extra water? Like, where does that go? And so there are risks to both not succeeding and risks to succeeding. And so how do you think about both of those things? And are those risks being shared equitably and ethically? Contextualization. Data, again, we've had this conversation already this morning. Data's not interesting unless you can contextualize it. I have so much more context for water now. It's very exciting to me. I will look at the snowpack in Washington State very differently from this point onward. I have a little cabin in the mountain, and we've had forest fires over the last couple of years, and I was telling my husband, I know why the snow melted this year so fast. And he was like, do you? And I was like, yes, because there's carbon ash. And anyway, it was very fascinating to me. And, I realized that one is probably not true in one thing, but I was listening yesterday. So contextualization is important. And it's not just tech. It is just not, tech is fascinating, and I have spent my whole life fascinated by technology. But if you don't know how to use tech, if people aren't using tech, if you don't have processes that support tech, we've said for a long time in the sort of tech for good space that it's all about people, processes, and then technology. You gotta have folks that aren't afraid of data. You gotta have folks that aren't afraid of using technology, and part of that is asking questions. What can this thing do for me? Why am I using this? Is there a better tool for me to be using? Should I even be using a tool? What is the purpose of all of this? And so really investing in thinking about how the workforce will interact with and use and be trained and feel comfortable in making decisions around technology is critically important. And then lastly, partner and collaborate. None of us get out of this alone. And if there's one thing that diving into data has really taught us over the years, is that as much as we know about data science, as much as our volunteers bring to the table in their own experiences and their own skills and their own perspectives, it's never quite enough. And so making sure that you are reaching out to the communities that will use these tools or be impacted by these tools, getting that feedback, thinking about other departments within your respective agencies, all of those things are critically important. And I'll make a big plug, and they don't know I'm going to do this, but the sharing data is absolutely important, and it's really hard. And so it's great to see the Data Collective pulling that data together. But just to put it in a little bit of context, and I know it's hard, and I know that there are risks involved, and I know that there are all sorts of concerns about accidental disclosures and all of those kinds of things. And I worked in the humanitarian space for a long time and spent a lot of time working in the refugee crisis over the last decade. If we can figure out a way to share data about refugee children's health, children, absolutely at-risk population in a foreign country, in a vulnerable situation, if we can figure that out, we can figure out how to share data about our water systems and what we need. It's not easy. I'm not trying to be flippant about it. It took us a long time to get there around, trying to figure out how we serve an entire population. But no water system stands on its own. Water comes from all sorts of different places. You're all connected. And so the more that you can do to share data and share data inside your respective jurisdictions with the people that are doing the building permits and the people that are, I'm not really sure what else now. I'm just making stuff up, so I'm not going to do that. So, but like I can imagine that water's pretty critical to a lot of different things. But knowing those things and working across, all of the levels of government and community service will be critically important. And so, I think there's a big move to do that. Good for you guys. It's great to see that it's moving, but it really does help build that culture of data and insight that we need. Again, that's not a perfect framework, but if we start down this path, and all of you have, you're here, you're leading the way in doing that, if we can get there, then what my hope is that data will help you work with greater certainty and efficacy and impact. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you very much.